Okay, we are going to, this is session 1 of Life of Christ. And if you have your syllabus here, we can go over the syllabus so we know what's required of us. A study of the life and ministry of Jesus Christ as recorded in the Gospels in light of the historical, cultural, geographic settings of the first century Israel. Attention will be given to contemporary application of Jesus' teaching. The course is a requirement that meets both the GSOM core curriculum requirements as well as credentialing requirements for the Assemblies of God. Upon successful completion of this course, individuals will be able to have a strong understanding of the life and ministry of Jesus Christ, grasp the importance of Christ in the areas of witnessing, miracles, faith, service, greatness, dealing with hardships, the importance of his death, learn the historical and contextual background to the ministry of Jesus Christ, learn about the imminent return of the Lord, comprehend the importance of the Great Commission. The required reading is Dwight Pentecost's book, The Words and Works of Jesus Christ, this little tiny book here. But you don't have to read it all. So.
I'm so glad you read that.
Yeah. Interestingly, let me tell you something about that. Of all the classes, this, not every class, but most, it's one of the hardest classes I had to find a good book. Very few books written on the life of Christ that were, some of the ones that I liked were out of print, no longer written anymore. Ralph Riggs wrote a good one. And so I've looked and looked and looked, and I finally ended up with this one. And so that's the reason for it, despite its size. Holy Bible and other reading assignments distributed throughout the semester. Course requirements. Course attendance and participation. Being present and being involved are essential. Unexcused absences and or tardiness will result in a reduction of the overall course grade. If you must miss a class due to an emergency, you're required to contact the instructor via phone or email prior to the class. And that's if possible, naturally. Exam. The exam will consist of material presented in reading, lectures, and other course experiences. The assignments. Report topics. Using a computer, prepare a paper, 3 pages in length, double-spaced. This is to be an exposition of one of the parables that Christ taught. The choice of the parable is yours. Please include a title, your name at the top, the scriptural reference, the reason for your choice, a summary of the parable and its meaning, as well as its relevance today in your conclusion. And then a journal. The student will be required to keep a journal which will consist of at least 2 pages of lecture notes per class session. Required reading. The student will be required to read the assigned textbook readings, and on the final 4 class sessions will turn in a 1-page paper sharing the percentage of the required reading they accomplished, highlighting important concepts of the week's reading, and noting any issues they would like to study further when they have time to do so. Also required will be the reading of the Bible text, Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Matthew, Mark, or Luke. This reading can be accomplished with tapes or CDs as one travels to and from work, if you would like to. So each week, from now on, you're going to be presenting that 1-page paper that has a percentage of the reading you did, the highlighting important concepts of the week's reading, and any issues you would like to study further. For those of you taking this online, you can email that to me on a weekly basis. Okay, for those in class, you can just bring it to class. The course format, lectures, class discussion, and presentations by the instructor and guest lecturers will make up the class time. There's your class schedule, and tells you what's the required reading for each class period. The required reading is to be done prior to the week it's to be discussed. So in other words, prior to next week, you read pages 43 through 60, 82 through 92, and 92 through 110. And a 1-page paper do each of the final 4 class periods. Also be reading or listening to Matthew, Mark, or Luke. course grading. Your course attendance and participation is 10%. Number 2, the exam is 35% of your grade. The paper on your parable is 15%. Your journal is 15%. Your required reading is 25%. So you're going to be sharing with me each week how much of your required reading you have done. And then my contact information is there on the last page. Any questions? It's not a lot of extensive work because the parable's only 3 pages and you're just taking class notes and you're reading as well. So, okay, so if you'll notice on class 1, no questions, so I can move on. If you notice on class 1 there, session 1, we're doing the class requirements, which we just did, and a lecture on the background during the time of Christ. And I want to share with you how things looked during the time of Christ, politically, religiously, etc. And so this is not in, I don't believe any of this is in your book. Could be, but I don't believe it is. This is all outside information, and so you need to be taking notes on this, and it'll be very beneficial, but you need to take some notes, okay? I want to talk for just a minute about the historical background during the time of Christ. And as we begin our study on the historical world in which Christ lived, we do so by focusing on Assyria, the nation of Assyria. While the Assyrian Empire rose and fell long before Christ came to earth, certain aspects of Assyrian policy had a long-term impact on Palestine and its people. So let's look at the first of these things that affected Israel. The first thing is Assyria being used as the vehicle of God's judgment. Assyria was used as the vehicle of God's judgment. I'm not sure how many of you have taken Old Testament yet, but you could recall from your Old Testament studies that after a period of prosperity and power under the kings Saul, David, and Solomon, Israel divided into 2 kingdoms around 922 BC. The 10 northern tribes were called the Northern Kingdom, or Israel, and the 2 southern tribes were called the Southern Kingdom, or Judah. So you had Israel and you had Judah after about 922 BC. Neither kingdom had wholly followed the commandments of God. And in the end, both of them forsook the law of Moses. But of the 2, the people of the northern kingdom offended God more consistently than the people of the southern kingdom. So they were the first to bring his wrath and judgment on themselves. And since his people had sinned, since God's people had sinned so much that there was no remedy, God used the nation of Assyria as an instrument to bring judgment on his people. What's your take on this? Why would God use ungodly people to bring judgment on his people? Any thoughts?
Could it be that he wanted them to see the difference that the pagans, how different they would be from what God had provided for them?
Okay, that could be a reason. And in reality, who knows the reason? Except to say, sin brings judgment. Sin brings results. And God used a nation that was strong enough to invade the northern kingdom, and that was Assyria. And in reality, he did so because his wayward people in this decadent kingdom of Israel had forsaken the law and had rejected him. And isn't that really what happens to us today when we forsake the law and reject God? Are we not out from under his covering? See, we're out from under his covering. So to ensure that the defeated Israelites would not attempt to rebel against their conquerors, the Assyrian king deported large numbers of them to other parts of the Assyrian Empire. He then brought non-Jews into the territory of the late northern kingdom to live among the Jews whom he had allowed to stay. And the obvious thing then happened. What was it? They intermarried. The Jewish people from the northern kingdom began to intermarry with these non-Jews. And in the years that followed, the Jews who remained began to intermarry with the non-Jewish people who'd been brought in. Consequently, this produced a mixed people. And what's the name of those mixed people? Samaritans. The Samaritans, part Jew, part non-Jew. The name Samaritan comes from Samaria, which is the name of the northern kingdom, the capital city. Now, before we go any further, let's just ask this question. This intermarriage caused a group of people that were neither Jew nor not Jew. They were mixed. Is this an indictment about mixed marriage? It's more an indictment about mixed spiritual belief. Mixed spiritual belief. Let me put myself on the edge here, especially for this younger generation who wouldn't understand, who, if not explained, probably wouldn't understand what I'm going to talk about. But there was a time, and I could be getting myself in trouble here. There was a time, and I just mentioned in the last class about that one pastor saying the whites should marry the blacks. There was a time when most, or not most, but a lot of parents believed that and advocated that. And it didn't necessarily mean that the parents were prejudiced. It could have meant that, but it didn't necessarily mean that, because when I grew up and when my kids were even younger, if two different cultures intermarried, the children weren't accepted by either culture. And so consequently, it would cause parents to try to dissuade their children from marrying other races, not because they were prejudiced, but because they knew the indictment it was on their children, their grandchildren, because they were not accepted by any culture. That's no longer a problem. Nowadays, there's no barrier in that sense. But in prior years, people tended to not want to see mixed marriages, not so much necessarily because they're prejudiced, though they could have been, but because they knew that the children were not going to be accepted. Nowadays, that's not even an issue. But there is an issue, and I'm stepping on eggshells here, but I've never been politically correct, so I might as well not start now. There's still an issue nowadays with, say, Christians marrying Hindus. It's the mixed spiritual belief. See, it's the mixed spiritual belief. And the same thing was going around then. The Samaritans attempted to worship God and at the same time to revere the gods of the new people the Assyrians had brought in. And since one cannot worship God and serve idols at the same time, the Samaritans were neither good Jews nor were they good Gentiles. They were mixed. They were mixed. So the first country that we're looking at, we're doing this very briefly, was Assyria. The second one is Babylon. And a little more than 100 years had passed after Assyria conquered Israel when a new power, Babylon, arose and in turn conquered Assyria. And during this period, Judah, the southern kingdom, continued to fail God more and more. And finally, God brought judgment on Judah just as he had on Israel, but this time he used Babylon as his instrument of judgment. And so for 70 years, conquered Jews were exiled in Babylon. And while this period of exile was limited, it had a powerful effect on the future behavior of the people of Judah, as we're going to soon see. The third kingdom that we're going to deal with is Persia. See, one kingdom after another began to rule the children of Israel. Persia. The new empire of Babylon remained in power less than 100 years, and then Persia, a new and more powerful empire, arose to defeat Babylon and take its place. Two important things occurred during the period in which Persia ruled Palestine. First, at the beginning of this period, the Persian king decreed that the Jews of the southern kingdom were free to leave Babylon and return to Jerusalem. That was interesting. The Persian king decreed that the Jews of the southern kingdom were free to leave Babylon and return to Jerusalem. And second, the last of the Old Testament prophets spoke during this period. The last of the Old Testament prophets. You should remember that God sent judgment on his people because they could never completely obey him. They had not only failed to obey him, but had also increasingly given themselves over to idolatry. In any event, the exile cured this problem, and the Jews never again practiced idolatry. They had learned their lesson. The fourth kingdom is Greece. I'm just quickly going through these. The fourth kingdom is Greece. The period of Greek dominance in the ancient Mediterranean and Middle East world came about rather suddenly. Greece owed its rise to the brilliance of a very famous man in history called Alexander the Great. The Persians ruled a mighty empire that included Palestine for about 200 years before they were conquered by Alexander's armies. And you should note that this conquest came about 330 years before the birth of Christ. So we're prior to Christ here, but we're bringing you some background history that does enter into what's going on during the time of Christ. Probably more than any other people, the Greeks exercised a long-lasting influence on the Jews. And this influence, as we're going to see as we go on, extended into the time of Christ. This Greek influence for 330 years prior extended into the time of Christ, and the culture of Greece was the reason for it. Alexander believed that Greek culture was the greatest on earth. So wherever he conquered, he left skilled leaders to establish Greek culture. And one of its most potent expressions was the Greek language, which became the common trade and diplomatic language of Alexander's vast empire. Greek culture and the Greek language thus tied the people of the empire together, making the spread of ideas and values much easier. Have you ever heard the word Hellenism? Hellenism. We use the word Hellenism quite commonly to describe everything that was connected with ancient Greek culture. In fact, as an example to show you how this affected the time of Christ, if you read Acts chapter 6, one of the first controversies that hit the new church was that the Greek Jews were complaining to the disciples that the Hellenistic Jewish widows were not being treated with the same honor and respect as the Hebrew widows. So there were Jewish Hebrew widows and there were Hellenistic widows, and they were not being treated the same. Okay, the Greek influence. When you hear or read the expression Hellenism or Hellenistic, you'll know that it refers either to Greek culture or its influence. What did they do? They Hellenized their subjects. They tried to make them as Greek as they possibly could. And Hellenism, as you'll see as you study history, became a great enemy of Judaism. Hellenism became a great enemy of Judaism. Unfortunately for the Greek Empire, Alexander lived only a short while. At the age of 33, he died, and soon his successors divided the empire he had established into 4 areas. But for our study, we're only going to be concerned about 2 of these areas, Egypt and Syria. Egypt and Syria were 2 of those 4 areas. And for nearly 150 years, these 2 countries battled each other for the possession of Palestine, Egypt and Syria. The next nation is Rome, or city, really. Rome. We can safely say that the Roman Empire was the most powerful empire in history. The Roman Empire was the most powerful empire in history, and it covered the greatest area for the longest period of time. 200 years after its great conquests, the remnants of the Grecian Empire also fell victim to the mighty power of Rome, and this power was to endure without serious challenge for nearly 600 years. The Roman Empire, without challenge for about 600 years. The Roman Empire exerted a great influence on the ancient world into which Christ came. And there are 3 contributions in particular that affected Palestine during his Christ's public ministry. 3 contributions of the Roman Empire that particularly affected Palestine during Christ's public ministry. Number 1, more than any other empire, Rome established peace throughout the far-flung empire that was to last for centuries. Peace that was to last for centuries. Number 2, rather than destroy the culture of Greece, Rome incorporated much of what was good and continued to promote it. Hellenism then continued to be a force for many years. And number 3, the legal and political system that Rome established was a model that many nations would use for centuries. The peace that Rome established made travel and communication everywhere in the empire easier than at any other time in history. You should notice from any map that you look at that the Roman Empire covered most of the Western world at that time. So it's easy to see that God chose the ideal time to send Christ into the world. The gospel message that would immediately follow his life on earth could be spread more easily during this time than at any other time in history. Can you see how God is in control and conducts events for his purposes? A term that you should learn from your outside readings about the period of time between the Persian rule and the beginning of the gospel accounts is called the intertestamental period. The intertestamental period. The period between Persian rule and the gospel accounts. And it represents a span of about 400 years between the last prophet's voice in the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament record. 400 years. That intertestamental period. And during this period, the religious system developed that Christ confronted in his ministry. It was during these years that the religious system developed that Christ confronted in his ministry. We're not going to go into Herod, but you could study the Herods if you would like to, along this line, the Herodian family genealogy. But let's talk for a minute about the political boundaries of Palestine. The political boundaries of Palestine. These were called regions. The different regions of Palestine. In Old Testament times, the land of Palestine was divided according to the tribes of Israel. But later on, it was divided into the northern and southern kingdoms, which we already talked about. After the exile and during the intertestamental period, the Palestine that Jesus knew emerged in its final form. And this is the Palestine that we're going to describe here and discuss here. Perhaps it would be best at this point for us to define what we mean by regions. Palestine was divided into different political units or regions. Different political units or regions, each of which could be ruled independently. And three of the most familiar of these regions were Galilee, Samaria, and Judea. Galilee, Samaria, and Judea were three of the most familiar. Each region had its own political boundaries, and each, in most cases, was ruled as a separate entity. Roman rulers employed this type of political division because they believed it was the very best way to control the vast empire. That's why they divided it like this, because they wanted to control the empire. Furthermore, they decided who would govern each of these political regions. See, the Romans had their fingers in it. Now, let me share with you 7 of these regions from the north to the south, moving from north to south, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The first was Syria. I'll just name them. Syria, Palestine, Galilee, Samaria, Judea, Perea, P-E-R-E-A, and Decapolis. Decapolis. Those are just some of those regions. But what's interesting is the reason the Romans allowed this is it helped them control, because they put different rulers over these different regions to help have control. Now, let's talk for just a minute about, and then I'll give opportunity for discussion here, if you have any, Jewish cultural differences. The cultural differences in the Jewish nation. The 2 regions in which Christ spent most of his time were Galilee and Judea. 2 regions where Christ spent most of his time were Galilee or Judea. And so we're going to look at these differences between the people in these 2 places. First of all, let's look at the Galilean. The Galilean. Christ was a Galilean. Christ himself was a Galilean. One Jewish proverb says, "Go north if you want riches. Go south if you want wisdom." Go north if you want riches, and go south if you want wisdom. This proverb more or less reflects the difference between Galilee and Judea. Galilee was very fertile with many fields and gardens. Vineyards and olive groves abounded throughout the country. And Galilee was also blessed with a multitude of busy, densely populated towns. far more Gentiles lived in Galilee than in Judea. This in itself gave Galilee an international flavor, and it tended to make the Galileans a more friendly, warm-hearted, and fervent kind of individual than his Judean counterpart. Jesus grew up in this open, friendly context, and he spent the greatest part of his public ministry in this area, in the area of Galilee. The next place that he spent quite a bit of time was in Judea, so let's look at the Judean. In contrast to Galilee, Judea was a dry, infertile region full of rocks and limestone, and most of its ancient cities were in ruins. There was a difference in the attitude of the people also. Generally, the Judean was proud, haughty, and reserved. He believed that he was more pure Jewish than the Galilean, more pure Jewish. And since fewer Gentiles lived in this region, the Judean had fewer occasions to observe and value other cultures. Moreover, he felt that he alone obeyed the law of Moses. And the fact that the temple, the focal point of the Jewish religion, was located in Jerusalem also made a difference. There was a lot of pride there. Any questions or comments? If nothing else, the opportunity to rest your hand for a second. A lot of information. But you see, all of this is important when you're trying to understand. That way, when you understand that about, let's say, Galilee, the Galilean or the Judean, when you read about him confronting one in Scripture, it gives you a little bit of understanding as to why maybe they responded the way they responded. When you get to know these different contexts. Any questions? Any comments? Okay. Let's talk for a few minutes then about the Jewish religious system. The Jewish religious system at the time of Christ. And it's very interesting. And a lot of these terms you will read in Scripture, and this will help you understand them a whole lot more. First, let's talk about the synagogues. The synagogues. One major result of the period of exile. And what do we mean by the period of exile?
They were
captured by another nation and sent out in exile. And so one of the major results of the period of exile was the institution of the synagogue. You may recall that when Babylon invaded Judah, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was destroyed. So the temple, which had been the central place of Jewish worship for centuries, was gone. Where they'd sacrificed, and they would travel to go make these sacrifices. There would not be another one until the returned exiles built one early in the Persian period. Meanwhile, where could God's people study the Scriptures and teach the law? Because that's where it was done, in the temple. So the answer was a synagogue. Or another, and what a synagogue means is meeting place. A meeting place. Where people could meet together to pray and could strengthen each other in their devotion to the religion of their fathers. Now you got to remember that no longer in the synagogue did they sacrifice. That was reserved for the temple. But they had to have a place to meet. And so they would meet in the synagogue. And so it was determined that wherever 10 or more adult Jewish men lived, a synagogue could be established. You could not establish a synagogue in a town where there was less than 10 adult Jewish men. So the synagogue, more than any other institution, was responsible for the study of the law and its continued importance in the hearts of the Jews. Later, when the second temple was built in Jerusalem, ceremonial sacrifices were again offered. But by the time of Christ, the synagogue had become the most important means of maintaining the Jewish religious system. In short, the synagogue served as a substitute for the temple, and it became the center of Jewish religious, civil, and educational activity. Everything revolved around the synagogue. And here was another important thing about the synagogue. Another difference between the synagogue and the temple, besides the sacrifice, was that the temple was only in one location that everybody had to travel to. Now the synagogue was allowed to be wherever there was at least 10 adult Jewish men in the city. Let's talk about the Pharisees. I'm doing this quickly, but it'll also get us out of here quicker. The Pharisees. The Pharisees were just one part of the Jewish religious system. There were also Sadducees, scribes, zealots, and the Sanhedrin, as well as the Essenes, who were there, but they were not a part of the gospel record. Taken together, these groups exercised an influence on society out of all proportion to their numbers. So who were the Pharisees? The word Pharisee means separated ones. The word Pharisee means separated ones. Since the Pharisees had such a strong zeal for the law, their greatest concern was that every part of the law of Moses, as well as the prophets and the writings, be obeyed. Every part of the law of Moses, as well as the prophets and the writings, were to be obeyed. And this zeal for strictly keeping the law emerged originally because of the captivity in Babylon. But however, Hellenism began to spread rapidly. Remember the Greek influence on the Jewish people. Hellenism began to spread rapidly across the empire and superimpose its cultural values on the subjected people. And as it did, many concerned Jews in Palestine feared that their brethren would once again forget God's law. So they joined together to resist the intrusion. And they also determined to do everything possible to ensure that Jewish people would not defile themselves with foreign cultures and religion, which was paganism. Since we understand the importance of the law, it's easy for us to see why a group like the Pharisees arose and how this would be a good thing. But sadly, they never changed. They became so concerned with obeying every detail of the law that they forgot God's original intention for it. Unfortunately, they became proud men as they placed too much emphasis on outward show and ceremony. In essence, they lost sight of the importance of the inner man. This became secondary to keeping every jot and tittle of the law. I would like to say that the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And what we need to be concerned with is the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. Right? The spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. As an example, and people would disagree with me in what I'm going to say, but that's okay, they have a right to be wrong. If you focus on the letter of the law, you don't eat pork because it's unholy. But if you focus on the spirit of the law, you don't eat pork because you know that God said don't eat it because it's not healthy for your body. That was the spirit behind it. Not just you eat this, you don't eat this. There was a spirit behind it, a reason behind it. And also you could go further and you could say, and Paul says that now everything is consecrated through prayer. but it's the spirit behind it. Why did God say, don't do this? You can become so focused on the don't do it that you miss the importance of it. Is that making sense? But they were focused on the don't do it or the do it. And it didn't become a heart change. It became a grit your teeth lifestyle. What's worse, perhaps, than that attitude is that they condemned others who did not follow their example. Instead of being separated from sin, they became separated from people. That's interesting, isn't it? The Pharisees actually began during the intertestamental period. They began during the intertestamental period. What's that period? The period behind the last prophet speaking and the gospel account. That 400-year period. The Pharisees rose to prominence back then. And while it's not clear to us just when they began, the first written record of them is dated between 134 and 104 BC. The first written record, 134 and 104 BC. Because of Hellenism coming in. And as you know, they fought Hellenism. Because Hellenism come in, a group of them known as the Hasidim, Hasidim, which means pious ones, was formed to fight against the intrusion of Hellenism. And their goal was to ensure that the purity of the law of God was maintained. It is possible, although we can't know for certain, that the Pharisees, as we know them in the New Testament, came from this group of men, the pious ones, the Hasidim. If indeed we may identify these Hasidim as the forerunners of the Pharisees, the process by which they became the Pharisees of Christ's day is not important. What is important is that over the years they changed, but not in a good way. Besides the change in attitude, another development occurred that was to have a great effect on the Pharisees' relation to their fellow Jews. And this was their emphasis on oral tradition. Their emphasis on oral tradition. Let's talk for a minute now about oral tradition. Oral tradition refers to a practice, truth, or law that is passed verbally from one generation to another. A practice, a truth, or a law that's passed verbally from one generation to another. By the time of Christ, the Pharisees felt that oral tradition, which amounted to their interpretation of the law, was as important as the written law. In fact, they believed that one must have a thorough knowledge of oral tradition if they were to interpret the law correctly. They could not interpret the law correctly without a thorough knowledge of oral tradition. And Christ referred to the problem that oral tradition had become when he told the Pharisees that instead of teaching true doctrine, they were teaching the commandments of or traditions of men in Matthew 15:9. You should notice that Christ condemned the Pharisees more strongly than any other group that he confronted. More strongly than any other group. A couple of interesting notes about the Pharisees is, first of all, they came from a middle-class Jewish background. They usually, not always, but usually came from a middle-class Jewish background. Therefore, Pharisees were not priests. They were usually not priests, and they did not use the temple as a place of religious duty. Instead, he spent most of his time in the synagogue. They were middle class, they were not priests, and therefore they spent most of their time in the synagogue instead of in the temple. The next group we want to talk about are the Sadducees. Any questions on the Pharisees before I move on? Or this oral tradition? Okay, the next group is the Sadducees. Although Sadducees made up the priestly group, they were usually the priests, it appears that they were more political than religious. They were the priests, but they were more political than religious. The Sadducees, like the Pharisees, had their origin in the intertestamental period, though there is no written record of it. And we have no clue about the meaning of their names. In fact, the New Testament gives us most of what we know of them. And beyond this, we rely on the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus, who wrote during the latter part of the 1st century AD. So we really don't know about the meaning of their name, except when I was in the 7th grade. Our pastor decided to teach the 7th grade boys for VBS. I think he did it because nobody else would take us. And I'll never forget him teaching about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And he said, and I've never forgotten, it's amazing the things that stick in your mind. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. Therefore, they were sad, you see. So he knew why they were named Sadducees. No, I'm just joking. But they did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees came from the wealthy, aristocratic class of Jews. And this, in most cases, was also the priestly class. The high priest and the chief priest were almost always Sadducees. The high priest and the... So when you read in the scripture about the high priest or the chief priest, you can almost determine that he was a Sadducee. They felt that Hellenistic culture and Roman authority were necessary for the good of the people. That Hellenistic culture and Roman authority were necessary for the good of the people. And the fact that they accepted this outside influence indicates that they valued politics more than they did religion. And since they were of the priestly class, their activities were centered mainly around the temple in Jerusalem. Thus, one seldom saw them in the synagogues. The Sadducees accepted only the written books of the law, but they rejected the books of the prophets and the writings. They just believed in the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And rejected all the other writings. They also rejected the oral tradition of the Pharisees, as well as teachings on angels and the doctrine of bodily resurrection. The Sadducees and the Pharisees constituted the two largest religious parties in Christ's day. One of the two groups, the Sadducees, were the smaller. Of the two groups, the Sadducees were the smaller, but by far the wealthiest. And in contrast with the Pharisees, they did not recruit members for their party. Rather, membership in this group was usually hereditary. Since the Sadducees accepted the intrusion of Hellenism into the Jewish community, they were not concerned about maintaining the purity of Jewish law and tradition. That did not concern them. Concern for wealth and position was more important to the Sadducees. Roman peace and stability guaranteed their privileged lifestyle. So they tended to guard the status quo. Obviously, they wanted neither a change of government nor anyone who might upset what they felt was a good arrangement. They had things going their way. There was very little upon which the Pharisees and the Sadducees agreed. They disagreed on almost every point. And you'll probably notice in the gospel record that Christ does not refer to the Sadducees as much as he did the Pharisees. However, you should not take this to mean that the Sadducees were not important. In the end, it was the Sadducees who became the greatest enemies of Christ. And with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, the Sadducees died out. The Pharisees, however, were the foundation of Judaism in later centuries. The next group is the Essenes, E-S-S-E-N-E-S. E-S-S-E-N-E-S. While the Pharisees majored on externals and the Sadducees on power and greed, a third shadow party offered relief from the corrupting influences of society. Although Scripture does not mention the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scrolls reveal that members of an ascetic brotherhood lived at Qumran, some 8 miles from Jericho, between 165 BC and AD 68. The historians Philo, Pliny, and Josephus also spoke of this group. So you don't see them recorded in Scripture, but we see them recorded in history. The Essenes appear to have forsaken society, choosing rather to live in the wilderness where they could prepare for the coming of the Messiah. They viewed themselves as the people of God, and all others, including the Jewish religious leaders, as God's foes. Moreover, they believed they were the sons of light, and they looked forward with great expectancy to the coming of the Messiah. At this point, they believed God would give them victory over the sons of darkness, as he broke in on the evil world system and restored his righteous rule. So they lived a very simple life. They provided their own food and necessities in the remote wilderness. They studied the Scriptures diligently. They abstained from marriage, which is why they died out. They lived in charity toward one another. They shared all their property. They provided for members too old or sick to work and refrained from business or military activity. And Josephus shows that they lived throughout Palestine, and only the fully initiated members lived in the separate communities. Like the Pharisees, the Essenes may have evolved from the Hasidim, but they were far more legalistic in obeying the law of Moses than even the Pharisees were. Isn't that amazing? Above all, though, they maintained hope in the coming Messiah. That was where their hope was. The Zealots is the next group. The Zealots, Z-E-A-L-O-T-S. While Pharisees and Sadducees tried to adjust to Roman rule, and the Essenes dreamed of God's intervention to deliver them, the Zealots searched for salvation more actively. They showed an even greater zeal in following the law than the Pharisees, but their zeal, unfortunately, was directed toward fanatical nationalism. The Zealots are first mentioned in the early years of Roman rule in Palestine. They strongly opposed the rule of Rome and refused to pay taxes to a pagan governor or emperor. And since God was Israel's true king, they felt that the Jewish nation should resist any attempt by other nations to govern them. Resistance, as it relates to the Zealots, is the key word. For their main objective was the complete overthrow of the Roman government. The complete overthrow. This feeling was so strong that the Zealots were willing to resort to any means, however violent, to achieve this aim. And since they viewed themselves as agents of God's judgment and redemption, the Zealots were totally unrestrained in punishing what they believed were acts of idolatry, apostasy, and collaboration with the enemy. While Rome tried repeatedly to suppress their violent actions, the Zealots simply became more fanatical and eventually launched a full-scale rebellion against Rome. Fueled by Jewish nationalistic fervor, the rebellion led to the eventual destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the Jewish nation in the Roman-Jewish War between AD 66 to 70. And this destruction in large measure was due to the Zealots. The Zealots originated again during the intertestamental period. That's when they began. The only reference to them in the biblical record is in relation to one of Christ's disciples. He was known as the Zealot. Simon the Zealot in the book of Luke suggests that at some time Simon may have been a member of this religious party in Luke 6:15. In any case, we're indebted to the historians for any information that we know about the Zealots. And next you have the scribes. The scribes. See, you notice all these are groups that Jesus confronted and Jesus had to deal with, and you begin to see then how the interchange began to happen based on their way of thinking and what he had to say to them. Unlike the Pharisees and Sadducees, scribes are mentioned a number of times in the Old Testament. Probably the most well-known scribe was Ezra. And you can notice from the period of King David until the time of Christ, the duties of the scribes seem to have changed. Earlier in the Old Testament, the scribes acted more as secretaries or clerks. But by the time of Christ, a scribe was more properly called a lawyer or a teacher of the law. In this later role, the scribe had three main duties. He acted as a copyist, a preserver, and an interpreter of the law. So the scribes were neither a religious sect nor a political party. Instead, they were a professional group. Their word on matters of the law were final. And it's easy for us to understand the respect the Jewish people gave to the scribes because we know how important the law was to them. The greater the esteem that the people had for the law, the greater the esteem they had for the experts of the law. In Ezra's day, a scribe frequently was also a priest. And this was true of Ezra himself. He was both a scribe and a priest. And while it's still possible for a scribe to be a priest, generally he was not during the time of Christ. The scribes usually aligned themselves with the Pharisees because both placed great emphasis on the written law and oral tradition. It would be wrong, however, to assume that the Sadducees did not also use scribes. The scribe or teacher, then, was an important member of the Jewish religious system because he lived in a society that was totally consumed by religious conviction and practice. And since the scribe was the leading authority in this system, his position of prominence was assured. And the last group I want to talk about is the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin. Now that we've had time to look at the various religious groups in Palestine during the time of Christ, let's look at the institution through which the Jews governed themselves, and this was the Sanhedrin. This was the institution through which they governed themselves. Except in some of the recent translations, you'll not see the word Sanhedrin in the New Testament. In most cases, the gospel writers use the word council or court. Council or court. Just remember that the two terms, council and court and Sanhedrin, are interchangeable. Our sources of information concerning the Sanhedrin, including the identity, the purpose, and the structure, are the New Testament and other Jewish writings of that period. What was the Sanhedrin? What was its purpose? The Sanhedrin was both the highest governing council and the local judicial council of the Jewish people. We don't know exactly when the Sanhedrin began, but some have suggested that the concept began as early as the days of Moses. You may have noticed that many important things which relate to the time of Christ came into being during the intertestamental period. And this was indeed a busy and a formative period for the Jewish people and the world in which they lived. And it appears that the Sanhedrin operated on two levels. Sanhedrin operated on two levels. The first level included the smaller councils, which was composed of either 7 members in smaller towns or 23 members in larger towns or cities. These smaller local councils were attached to synagogues throughout Palestine and exercised wide powers in civil and religious matters. You should remember that the Jews saw very little difference between the two, civil and religious matters. The second level was the Great Sanhedrin, or the Supreme Court itself, which was located in Jerusalem. Its activities centered around the temple. The Great Sanhedrin was a group of 71 men who came mostly from influential families and represented 3 groups: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the scribes. The Sanhedrin also included a representation of elders, and these men usually came out of the wealthy noble class from which the Sadducees were drawn. The high priest, a Sadducee, presided as the leader or president of the council. And while it's true that the authority of this council was limited to Judea, its influence was felt throughout Palestine and the surrounding countries. So that's a little bit about both the political and the religious system during the time of Christ. And it's going to help you understand interchanges and reactions that Christ had to these people and their reactions to him. As an example, let me give you one example. I don't have the actual location. I'm just talking in my mind, but it was in the book of Acts. When the Pharisees and the Sadducees let me get this correct. I'm not sure, I can't remember if this was Paul or Christ, but I remember the situation. Where the Pharisees and the Sadducees both ganged up on them. And I think it was Christ, but this is terrible, especially when I'm taping it. I remember the concept. I don't remember the actual. I remember the engagement, though. The person that they were ganging up on said, well, I think it was Christ. I'll answer your question if you answer mine. In the resurrection, whose wife shall they be? It was Jesus, right? At first I was thinking Paul, but I'm thinking, no, it was Christ. Whose wife would she be? Because they'd ask a question to Jesus, trying to trick him, it says. And he says, well, let me ask you a question. In the resurrection, whose wife shall they be? Well, what's the scenario here? The Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. So all of a sudden, you notice in the story, the Pharisees and Sadducees start getting on each other over their difference in interpretation of the resurrection. And Jesus, he just walked away scot-free. See, he knew what they believed. And this helps you understand some of those interactions and exchanges. So, any questions? Comments?
So interesting.
It is interesting.
So much knowledge to help you understand
Good.
better.
Good. Well, I'm going to let you go because I think you're tired. And I've got some grandkids at home. So we will continue next week.